welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alex Paul from InvestorStream, and I'll be your host this morning. Today, we'll be hearing from Redbank Copper Executive Chairman Mike Hannington, who will discuss the upcoming plans for Redbank, as well as operational progress since the appointment of the new board in August 2019. A bit of housekeeping first. Please feel free to send in your questions via the chat platform, in the question pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. You could also email them to me at alex@investorstream.com.au. We'll address the questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll attempt to get through as many questions as time permits. You can also download a copy of the presentation by navigating to the handouts pane in the control panel. A copy of the webinar will also be available on Redbank's website later today. For now, I'd like to throw it over to Mike, who's going to commence proceedings for us. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. Well, it'll be a long time since anyone's heard from Redbank Copper. Redbank went into suspension from trading on the ASX in August last year. So thank you very much. This is the first opportunity that I've got to take you through the Redbank story in 2020. Just taking you through the disclaimer there. Onto the capital structure. So Redbank currently has just under 245 million shares on issue. The company last traded in beginning of August at 1.9 cents per share. Current market capitalisation is a little over 4.5 million, with $700,000 in cash at the end of the March quarter. I'm the chairman of the company. I've got a background as a geophysicist and a lawyer. It seems like an unusual combination. I got my degree in geophysics back in the 80s and a law degree in the early 2000s. I've worked for a number of large mining companies during my career, and more recently for smaller companies and as a technical consultant. Daryl, who is a non-exec director, he was the genesis of Northern Star and more recently Bellevue, so he's got a pretty good track record of identifying opportunities for explorers and miners. Keith Middleton is our true independent director. It's Keith that is the director that keep questioning why we are doing all of this for shareholders and keeping us focused on increasing shareholder value. The Wiley Group is a major shareholder with just over 14% of shares on issue. The top 20 shareholders, we've got a very concentrated share register holding just over 70%. We've got a total of 487 shareholders at the moment. So in the last couple of months, we reduced the amount of shareholders. We closed out some of the shareholders that held unmarketable parcels. So management in total holds just over 12% of the company. So one of the attributes that Redbank has, the new Redbank, is that we've got the ability to raise funds from our major shareholder, who's very supportive of what we're doing. We believe we've got the right people on board, and we've rediscovered the Redbank project that we believe is a fantastic project with some good opportunities in the near term to develop some of the assets there. So as described, I've got a background as a geophysicist and a lawyer. More recently, I acted as a consultant before joining Redbank in Canada, evaluating base metal projects. Daryl is the head of Viridian Capital, so he's got a background raising finance in the capital markets. And Keith has got a long and varied background, worked for BHP in the past and run his own businesses. So why are we going to the effort to create a new Redbank? Back in June, July 2019 last year, Redbank was not in a good situation, and the Wiley Group was a major shareholder trying to understand how to rebirth Redbank, and in conjunction with Daryl Henthorn, who was an existing shareholder, realised that the best way to do that was to try and rejuvenate the board and try and recapitalise the company. But why would we go about doing that? Well, the Wiley Group has got a history of investing in the mining and exploration sector, and believed that copper was a commodity that over the next couple of years was reasonably easy to understand supply and demand. A lot of the large mines are reducing their cut-off grade. The demand is continually increasing as the world electrifies. So the new board is committed to unlocking value in Redbank. One of the features of the Redbank project that hasn't been clearly communicated to the market in the past is the legacy mining operation that was at the Sandy Flat mine that's in the centre of the Redbank project area. That has significant copper on surface in the form of old heap leaches and a tailings dam. Redbank purchased that mine in 2005, and no commercial mining operation was ever undertaken post the purchase. There was a small operation trying to recover copper out of the heap leaches, but the copper price was low and it never became a commercial operation, so that sat there. The Sandy Flat mine is notorious because during the wet season, the rainfall causes the copper that's in those leaches to over the dams and the tailings storage facility to overflow. So there's copper contamination that goes into the creek system. That's been well reported throughout the Northern Territory and even further. In June 2016, the Northern Territory government entered into an agreement with Redbank and took liability to clean up that contaminated site. So Redbank has no ongoing liability to clean up the contaminated site, although we do still own the copper that's above the surface. The Northern Territory government has got a mine rehabilitation fund that miners and explorers in the Northern Territory contribute to. That's a fund that the government can use to undertake environmental rehabilitation of legacy mine sites like Sandy Flat and a number of others that are in the Northern Territory. So one of the things that Redbank management did when we came on board in August is clearly get a clear understanding of that environmental legacy and what the mine site looks like. We flew out there in October last year and we collected water samples from the pit and also rock samples from the tailings dam and also the heap leaches. So over the last few months, we've been undertaking hydrometallurgical studies to understand how we can assist the Northern Territory government in cleaning up that site. The challenge obviously is to be able to return fresh water to the stream system and extract the copper from the dumps. So we've been in negotiations with the Northern Territory government about that. We've got support from the traditional owners and the Northern Lands Council, and we are currently progressing a series of studies. We're coming to the final stage of putting a proposal to the Northern Territory government about undertaking a rehabilitation operation. So once we're able to get that environmental rehabilitation undertaken at the Sandy Flat mine, we believe it'll really assist us with creating a new reputation with the traditional owners, the Northern Land Council, the pastoralists in the area. We hope to attain a new social licence to operate for a brand new effort to undertake copper exploration over a very large tenement holding that we have in the far eastern portion of the McArthur Basin. I just want to go through what the challenges were when we took over in 2019. So back in April 2019, the Supreme Court handed down a decision on the bankruptcy of the previous chairman of Redbank. The previous chairman had a stable of companies that were providing loans to Redbank and also technical and corporate services. Another challenge was that when we took over in August, the Redbank project tenements were only a number of days from forfeiture for non-payment of the tenement rents, and the board back then appeared not to have the ability to raise capital. Obviously, there was clear reputational risks with the company, and also the public had a problem understanding the environmental liabilities and where those lay. So fast forward to 2020, and the new board has driven some solutions from those problems that we identified in 2019. So in August, a Section 249D was issued to the previous board, and the shareholders voted the old board out and a new board in. When the new board came in, we put the company into a trading halt and then into a voluntary suspension so that we could discover all the problems. What we did within a number of days is get a loan of $300,000 from two existing shareholders. One of them was the Wiley Group, to pay the rents, complete all reporting, and put the Redbank project back into good standing. So we had to make sure that the first thing we did was to secure the main asset of the company. Then we looked through and negotiated payment to outstanding creditors. There was a large number of them, so we sought to negotiate a settlement with those creditors. We then obtained another loan in October, November of 1.5 million and commenced exploration studies at site, and also started discussing how to undertake a rehabilitation project at the Sandy Flat site with the Northern Territory Government. Redbank's got two projects. I've started discussing the Redbank project that we have, which is close to the Northern Territory Queensland border. We've got in total a little over 3,000 square kilometres of ground. There's a bit over 1,000 square kilometres that's granted, and about 2,300 square kilometres that's in application. That application is due to be granted sometime later on this year. So that ground was applied for in December last year. There's an existing JORC 2004 resource. Works currently being undertaken to update that resource to a JORC 2012 resource. Over the tenement package, there's a vast number of breccia pipes that have been identified, but within a central area of 10 square kilometres, there's over 50 breccia pipes, and only 7 of those form the existing mineral resource estimate. We also have another project called the Millers Creek project, and I'll briefly go over that project at the end of this webinar presentation. That tenement package is sandwiched in between ground held by Oz Minerals and FMG. So let's just go back through the history of Redbank. Redbank was, the Redbank mine was, that is now, it's a combination of old workings. One of them, which is the old Sandy Flat mine, but there's a number of prospects that turned into small mine workings that were operated in the early 1900s. Redbank purchased that mining operation with surrounding tenements in December 2005, and from 2016 to 2015 there was a number of small drilling programs that were undertaken, and from those drilling programs with previous data, SRK estimated the JORC 2004 resource that I discussed on the previous slide. You can see where the Redbank project is located. Off to the northwest, there's the MacArthur River mine. That's a zinc dominant deposit, but it's still within the same basin. So what Redbank is looking for is a copper deposit in similar basin and similar rocks. So I've taken you through some of the timeline in the past. Let's just go from when we took over management of the company on the 2nd of August last year. As I described, we had a number of the key tenements that were due for forfeiture on the 9th and the 14th of August. We took out the $300,000 loan and paid for those rents. In August and September, we completed all the reporting. In October, we visited site. In November, we applied for additional tenements surrounding the core Redbank tenements. And then in at the end of November, beginning of December, we started a 6-week field program. Over the last few months, we've been able to acquire a lot of the historic data. That's not just hard copy data, but digital data. We've also acquired old archive boxes of hard copy files, and also a lot of the drill core. On site, there's about 25,000 metres of drill core, and in Perth, there's quite a number of drums of drill core that was going to be used for metallurgical test work. So we have access to that core and samples in Perth, and also a large amount of drill core on site. The next slide shows the amount of breccia pipes that are located within a very small 10 square kilometre area, and the deposits that form the current JORC resource. There's been a lot of clever geologists that have done work on this ground. Back in 1970, Newmont were here for a couple of years. They withdrew from the project. What ended up happening at the end of '71, the US President Nixon broke the Bretton Woods Agreement, so the gold standard was broken, where the US dollar was pegged to a gold price of $35 an ounce. And so Newmont withdrew from this copper project and went back to the US and started exploring purely for gold. There's been a number of other companies that have explored the ground. CRA explored the ground for a number of years doing some mapping. They obviously discovered Century, that's off to the east. So a number of the big companies have had a look at the ground, and in between that time, a number of smaller companies have reviewed the data. But in its current form, Redbank has held this ground since the end of 2005. On the next slide, what I've shown there is the Sandy Flat mine, and just tried to show the problems with the contamination of copper that's coming out and flowing out of the Sandy Flat mine. There's an existing pit at Sandy Flat that goes down about 50 metres, and that's filled with water. When that water overflows, it goes down Hanrahan's Creek and through a creek system, and then makes its way across the border and off to the Gulf of Carpentaria. The copper contamination is a number of kilometres down this creek system, and it's caused a huge reputational risk, not only for Redbank, the company, but for Northern Territory government. And the challenge is for all the parties to come together and ocean exercise at the Sandy Flat mine site. So we're a long way down that path. We've completed a number of studies. We believe that we have a process to extract copper out of that Sandy Flat pit water and be able to discharge potable water into the creek system and recover the copper out of the pit water. We're also undertaking studies looking at the heap leaches, heap leach pads, and the tailings storage facility. The next slide shows a couple of diagrams looking a little bit closer in on Sandy Flat. You can see on the slide to the left that when the rain falls on the tailings dam, and as the rain descends into the soil profile, it actually goes down through that profile and ends up in the Sandy Flat pit. So that's one of the reasons why there's quite a high copper grade in the pit water. One of the changes that's occurred with the new management is we're committed to identifying the problems and solving them. And this is just one of the issues that we intend solving out at Sandy Flat. We've got a program of exploration planned, some soil sampling later on this dry season. So what we're doing at Sandy Flat is taking all that old data, putting it together, and pulling out old prospects and rediscovering breccia pipes that were previously identified by explorers and finding new ones, and undertaking surface evaluation work, soil sampling, to see if we can identify additional areas with mineralisation over the tenement area. Just confirming again that Redbank, the company, has no outstanding environmental liability for the site. There is some remaining infrastructure there. As part of the proposal to rehabilitate the site, the old infrastructure will be broken down and removed. There are still some parts of that infrastructure that can be used for a future remediation project at the site. I now want to move on and briefly talk about our Millers Creek project in South Australia. You can see from the slide there that the Millers Creek project is sandwiched in between ground held by Oz Minerals and FMG. That area has previously been explored by a number of companies. They have drilled some of the gravity highs that have been discovered there, but from reviewing previous data, it appears as though those gravity highs that are believed to represent IOCG targets, iron oxide copper gold targets, have not properly been drilled. This next slide shows the magnitude of those gravity highs. And for comparison, the Olympic Dam IOCG deposit that BHP are currently mining, it had a 12 milligal gravity anomaly on top. The gravity anomalies at the Millers Creek project go from around 12 milligals down to about 5 milligals. So they're significant gravity anomalies. Those gravity anomalies are defined by a density contrast, where the iron associated with an IOCG deposit has a high density compared to the surrounding rock. And when you do a gravity survey over the surface, you get a gravity anomaly. Whether those IOCG deposits contain economic amounts of copper and gold requires drilling, and that requires deep drilling into these systems. So we will reevaluate all the data and then seek to find a joint venture partner to undertake a drilling program. We're also going to undertake a small capital raising, and on Friday we announced a capital raising within our 25% share capacity. We've executed mandates with Viridian and CPS. We'll determine the best time over the coming weeks when to raise those funds. We've got a work program ahead that we will announce over the coming weeks, and we look forward to sharing all that over the coming months with the dry season in Northern Australia, hopefully allowing us to get on the ground if the COVID restrictions on movement in between the state borders allows us to. One of the things we're going to do over the next few months is relog all the drill core. I said earlier we've got about 25,000 metres of drill core. So all up, there's about 30,000 metres of diamond drilling that's been undertaken at Redbank. I've described going out and doing some more regional soil geochem sampling. That was the discovery method for the Century deposit. We're going to go out and do some more field mapping. Some of these breccia pipes are exposed on the surface, so it's the simplest and cheapest form of exploration is just walking the ground. We've got a proposal that we are further developing before the Northern Territory Government to retreat the surface stockpiles. And what we see in the Redbank project is the ability to use modern exploration to reveal the next series of copper mineralised systems out on the Redbank project. With the Millers Creek project, we're currently undertaking desktop studies, and we will provide data packs to potential joint venture partners when we determine to consider joint venturing that project. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Alex.
Thanks very much, Mike. Quite an interesting sort of presentation there. Now we've had a couple of questions that have come through. So I think the first one's, Mike, if you can hear me, the first one's on everyone's lips. Is there an update on the recommencement of trading? Mike, can you hear me? Mike, hello? Mike? Unfortunately, we seem to have we can't hear Mike. So look, we've had a couple of questions that have come through. If you just bear with me for 5 seconds, I'll see if I can get Mike on the line. Now, I've managed to get Mike on the phone. Mike, if you can hear me, the first question is there an update on recommencement of trading?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex, and thanks everyone for listening in to the webinar earlier on. I took it pretty slowly, so there was a lot of information for everyone to get through. Yeah, as far as an update on relisting, recommencing trading on the ASX, the ASX has asked us to come back to them with our exploration plan, what work we're going to undertake over the next 6 to 12 months. So we're currently discussing that with the ASX now. We hope to have an answer from the ASX on all of that within about 7 days.
Mike, can you give us an update on the commercial proposal currently before the NT government to remediate the Sandy Flat project, and what are the next steps in this process?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's been a fair amount of confusion over the last few years about what those commercial agreements actually were and who's got the liability for what. So maybe I'll just step back a little bit. So on the 29th of June 2016, Redbank entered into an agreement with the Northern Territory government, where the Northern Territory government took over all the environmental liability for cleaning up the Sandy Flat mine site. The money that the Northern Territory government is going to use to clean up that site comes from a mines rehabilitation fund that was set up in 2013. That fund garnishes 1% of the money that Northern Territory miners and explorers spend on their tenements every year, and that fund currently has got over $30 million in the account, and it receives a bit over $8 million per year. So really it's other explorers and miners in the Northern Territory that are going to fund the rehabilitation of the site. So the prime aim of that rehabilitation is to return fresh water into the environment rather than water that is leaking out of the pit and contaminating it. The issue for Redbank is that we own the copper on the site. So we will take that copper and then we will on-sell the copper to others that need it. So we believe that forming the copper as copper sulfate will be useful for other miners within a few hours trucking distance. And just to develop that a little bit further, the nearest mining operations are the McArthur River Mine, owned by Glencore, and Mount Isa, owned by Glencore. They use liquid copper sulfate that we propose to produce in their zinc flotation plants. So that liquid copper sulfate enables higher recoveries of zinc out of their zinc float plants. So we think we've got a willing purchaser very close to us. The alternative for Glencore is for them to purchase solid copper sulfate crystals out of China and Russia and import it in and then turn it into liquid themselves. So we think we've got a pretty compelling business there for selling the copper that's extracted out of the water and the dumps.
Mike, can you just elaborate on what you mean by having a social license to operate in the Northern Territory, and how how would this help with getting exploration moving at the Redbank project?
Yeah, well, social license to operate is a bit of a catch-all phrase. What's happened in the past, and I went through this in the presentation, that the Redbank camp and the Redbank site was abandoned sometime around November 2015, and that ended up in an argument between the Northern Territory government and Redbank about cleaning up the legacy contamination from previous mining that had occurred there. And as I described earlier, the NT government and Redbank entered into an agreement 6 or 7 months after the camp was abandoned, and the Northern Territory government took on that liability. So that's really the first thing, is there was some legacy issues with the Northern Territory government. We think that over the last 6 months, we've had a number of meetings with the Mines Department in the Northern Territory in Darwin, where we've started engaging with them. We've proposed a technical solution using an ion exchange unit to extract copper out of the water. So we think we've improved our reputation with the Northern Territory government. Also, we've been dealing with the traditional owners and the Northern Lands Council. And as you'd imagine, the Northern Lands Council's keen for the contamination, the copper contamination in the creek systems to be cleaned up. And basically the plan there is to flush all that out with discharging clean water from the Redbank mine. Also, we've been dealing with the local pastoralists, and if anyone's been following the news there, a lot of the pastoral leases throughout the Northern Territory have been transferred into big major corporations. It's not just small little family operations anymore. So the station has recently been purchased by the Macmillan family that have got stations in Queensland and the Northern Territory. So we think that with all those three groups, Northern Territory government, traditional owners with the Northern Land Council, and with the pastoralists, that with mining and exploration company Redbank re-engaging with all of them and proposing to clean up the site, that we have tried to clean up our act from the way in which we were undertaking exploration and not really addressing the issues at that site over the last few years.
Just on that, Mike, what level of dialogue does Redbank have with the Northern Territory government, and how are you addressing any legacy issues connected to the old Redbank copper?
So there's probably two parts of that. As far as actually engaging with the Northern Territory government, we're dealing with people at the DPIR, Department of Primary Industry and Resources. So that's the department, like in the other states, that issues mining tenements. They have a legacy mines unit there that has been doing studies at the Sandy Flat mine, hydrogeological studies to understand what the contamination actually is there. We've been dealing with members of the department discussing how we can help solve the problems there. We've also spoken to people at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. There's been a number of historical environmental surveys that have been done over the area. So over the last 6 months, over a number of meetings in Darwin, we believe that we're across all the technical issues. As far as the issues to do with traditional owners, we were actually approached by the Northern Lands Council. So we've spent a fair amount of time listening to their concerns, and we're hoping that, given we've undertaken hydrometallurgical studies ourselves, that's a pretty good start to get a solution on the ground. What we're really trying to do is execute a rehabilitation program on the ground. Given that Redbank itself has been exploring there since 2005 and only under new management since August last year, the cleanup of the Sandy Flat site is not an economically viable undertaking, and that's one of the reasons why the environmental liability got transferred to the Northern Territory government. So it's pretty hard to unscramble the egg with all of that past history, But summarising all of that, the Northern Territory Government will be undertaking a rehabilitation exercise that they'll pay for from a fund that has currently got about $32 million in it, and clean water will be discharged into the creek system, and Redbank will be taking delivery of copper in the form of copper sulfate and selling that on.
Thanks, Mike. And just one final question on your upcoming capital raising. How can interested parties participate?
I think get in contact with Viridian and CPS Capital. So they've got websites, and I think it's probably pretty easy to contact people from both those companies. Fantastic,
Mike. Really appreciate you jumping on board and giving us the presentation and taking the time out to answer a few questions as well. We will be keeping, I'm sure everyone will be keeping a really close eye on how Redbank Copper develops over the near term. But thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alex. Look, I'm pretty excited about where the future is going for Redbank, so I look forward to updating everyone over the coming months.
Thanks, Mike. And look, that's all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. And again, thanks, Mike, for the presentation. If you haven't done so yet, you can download the presentation in the handouts panel, but it's also up on the ASX as well, so you can navigate and find it there. As I mentioned before, a recording of the webinar will be on the Redbank website later today. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send them through and I'll forward them on to the company. But thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.